hard to tell in the lighting that I've got. That's probably the best you're going to get. You see the cheeks are purple, and the straw is starting to work its way out into the faces of the hammer. I don't particularly need to soften the faces. This being 4140 doesn't harden all that much. You can see on the other side it's a little bit backlit. But yeah, the faces themselves can stay pretty much full hardness, but I want those cheeks to be relatively soft because that's where the weak point is for the head. So this is the second head. I've got to do the third, just sitting down there, and then we're done. So this is what I love about the fire ant grinder, is that it locks in the open position so that you can easily change belts, which is great because having to do this whilst holding the belt down can be a massive pain. So just having that ability to lock it in place is a great advantage. So now what I'm going to do is some 120 grit. This is actually a worn 120, but I don't particularly need to remove a lot of material. Now I'm just going to be polishing the faces. I started with a 60 grit, so I'll do this 120, and then I've got a cork 600 that I'll then do the polishing on. Right, so I've finished the 120 grit, and realistically, for a lot of forging work and stuff like that, this would be sufficient. It would be, you know, enough that the finish on the forged piece wouldn't be too rough. You wouldn't see a lot of lines and stuff like that in it. When I did the rounding end of the hammer, you'll notice that I used the top area of the grinder, which is actually a slack between the top idler wheel and the platen, and that just gives me a bit more of a radius to the surface of the hammer. It's a bit of a softer curve rather than the hard backing of the platen. Now the fire ant grinder, Jake Mantell of Fire Ants Fabrication decided to do borosilicate glass backed platens. It's a 240mm platen, I believe, and the glass backing means that the heat that's left in the grinder is so much more minimal than when you have a mild steel backing. I've used mild steel backed grinder like the Noob grinder, which you may have seen in my channel earlier, and that thing used to build up heat so badly that at this point I wouldn't be able to touch that without burning myself. This thing doesn't do that half as much, and it stays relatively true as well, you know, rather than caving in over years of constant the back of the belt constantly wearing away at it. The other thing is that this grinder runs at about 7,000 surface feet per minute on average, which is absolutely insane. Tears material away. You actually have to be really careful when you're using your heavier grits, your lower grits, that you don't remove too much material. But anyway, next on the list is to trade over to the cork belt, which may look more gritty, this one here, but it's actually cork that's suspended in a glue matrix, which also has a very fine abrasive, about 600 grit. So what I'm going to do with that is just true up all of the surfaces, and then I'll take it over to the buffer. One thing to be mindful of as well with these 2x72 belts especially is something I wasn't aware of when I first started using a 2x72. Is that some of these belts are directional. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to make it out, but see these arrows here? These actually denote the direction in which the belt should go. And this is actually due to the glue line there is strong in one direction and the other direction maybe not so much. That being said, I've used the 2x72 with belts going both ways, and it's never really caused an issue, but it is something to be mindful of, because you want to go with what the designer of the belt kind of decided that it should be used like, because in the end of the day, if you get injured because you weren't following the product description, then it's kind of your own fault. So yeah, make sure that it's running in the right direction. For instance, there's your 120 grit finish. It's fairly faceted. There's your cork 600. There are still a few little kind of spots of faceting, but as you can see, it's overall a lot smoother. And once I take it to the buffer, that'll come out almost like a mirror. So I've got to do that to all of the faces of these three hammers, and then we'll go to the buffer. Okay, so I'm here at the buffing wheel. We've got a stitched tough cotton wheel. It's the roughest cotton wheel I have. I also have a stitched soft cotton wheel as well, but I don't normally use that for hammers. All I'm going to do is use this and some green cutting compound, and we're going to polish these hammers up. But it helps if I turn it on. So yeah, as you can see, it's now almost mirror shiny. You can almost see the camera in it. There it is. Anyway, so yeah, I've got to do that to all of the faces of all the other hammers, and then they'll be ready for handling. So here are the three polished hammerheads. Now you might see some minor scratching and stuff like that on the hammer faces. That's not actually a big deal, because any blacksmithing hammer eventually looks like this. Now this started out like those, and as you can see it's got the same profile, but the scale on the work tends to put in a little bit of denting and that kind of thing. I accidentally hit something rather hard with it there, so it's a bit flattened out, got a dents in it. But this is what a hammer face looks like after, you know, maybe 3 days work on the anvil. Even if you kind of don't look at the dents, but if you just look at the surface finish, there's all kinds of stippling in it, purely from the forge scale, the scale on top of the piece. So those scratches aren't going to do a great deal of harm, and obviously it's not going to stay shiny much longer after you start smacking on it. So smacking with it. So this is more of an aesthetic thing, but these are now ready for handles, and that'll be the next thing that I get onto. Now, when I forge hammers, a lot of the time it naturally ends up with a little bit of sharp edges around the, especially the bottom part of the hammer hole, the hammer eye hole. The top tends to be flared more than the bottom, because the top is the last piece that the drift is going through, with the wedge going downwards. So all I do is take a chainsaw file. This is a cheap chainsaw file, and I'm just going to kind of run it around the edges, just to remove any burrs or anything like that. and kind of soften the edge for the handle to enter the eye hole. If I don't do this, then what can happen is that it'll chisel into the handle material rather than trying to squeeze the hammer, the material into the eye hole, which means you'll get somewhat of a less strong fit up. It's not a massive difference, but it's just that little bit extra that you can go to make a better product. So I'll probably sit here for the next 20 minutes just truing all the eye holes up, and then I'll be able to do some handling. Now, unfortunately, my supply of decent handlewood material to make handles out of has kind of dwindled with my ability to buy it. It's fairly expensive, and so I've resorted to the one place that I know I can get decent hammer material, which is Bunnings. These are prefab handles. Now, I don't just go down to the local Bunnings and grab any handle. There are definitely things you need to look out for. For instance, these ones are specifically marked spotted gum. These are specifically marked the actual timber that they're used. If it just says hardwood, then it could be anything. And I've seen them use pine, I've seen them use jarrah, I've seen them use a couple of other different hardwoods that end up cracking and breaking really easily. I actually have an axe handle here that a friend of mine bought for an axe, and it is pine. It is just nothing but pine. It's terrible. But yeah, these are marked Australian spotted gum, which means that they have to be spotted gum by law, because otherwise it's false advertising. The other thing you look for is to make sure that the grain line is running at least close to parallel with where the hammer faces are going to be. So, you know, when I hang the hammer, it's going to be sitting this way. So therefore, I want the hammer, the grain line to be running in that direction. You can always look at the haft end or the head end to find out where your grain is running. So I found two handles. Unfortunately, they didn't have a third that was to my standard that have that parallel-ish grain line. That mean that the handle isn't going to fracture in your hand whilst you're swinging, which is a good thing. So anyway, first thing I do when I'm hafting is to just check to see where I need to remove material. Now hold the hammer handle up to the eye. The way I make my drifts is I forge them circular and then flatten them off. And so these are actually almost a perfect fit, top and bottom. But it needs to be thinned on the sides just a little bit. I haven't found that this weakens the material at all. Obviously, I've sold a few of these now, and I haven't heard back from anyone that they've broken. If they do, I'll replace them, for sure. But yeah, it doesn't really affect the handle too much. So, if for anyone who's followed my channel before, before now, they know that I love my woodworking tools, my handwork tools. And so this is one of my favorites. It's a spoke shave. It's an old Stanley. And basically all I do is take my spoke shave and I'm just going to remove 4 or 5 passes from each side, trying to get as even a material removal as I can from where I saw it was binding. And I'm just using the rag and the vise to protect the wood from the vise jaws. If you've got rubber vise jaws, obviously that's not an issue. But I don't want to have vise teeth marks in my new hammer handles. And before I remove too much material, I just want to check that the fit up's going, and there you go. That's already on there perfectly. Yeah, there we go. There's almost no gap around the edges, which is exactly what we want, and it seats most of the way up. And then all I do is hang the hammer upside down, and using a small rubber mallet or my wooden mallet, which is sitting around somewhere, just strike the haft end using the inertia of the head to drive it onto the shaft. And you can normally hear and feel when it won't go any further. There you go, and that's what I want to see. I want to see shavings getting peeled up from the haft. There are small shavings from the sides as well, but you can't see them in there. And as you can see around the top of the head, there is very little gap, which is good. It means that when I go to hammer in the wedge, it won't move too far. What I'm going to do is first I'm going to knock this off, because then I can cut a slit into it. Say hi to Christy in the background there.
Hi.
And then I can drive a wedge in. There it goes. So as you can see, good fit up all the way around. So now I just need to cut the wedge slot and we're ready to go. So I'm just sawing the wedge just down to just above the top of the where the hammerhead met, and I just dropped one of them on the floor, but luckily it didn't land on one of the faces because concrete will mark this stuff up. Alright, and now all I have to do is make a wedge, which is pretty simple. I normally just use a random offcut of Jarrah, which I don't. Oh, I do have. There we go. This is an old Jarrah floorboard. Am I going to be able to get that angle? Yes. There it is. So I just clamp it in the vise at an angle. And then saw down pretty much almost vertical. Not too vertical, obviously, because I want to make a relatively thin wedge. So there you go. Cut my wedge piece. Now this is probably enough to make enough wedges for all three hammers. And all I need to do to get those wedges is, got to reorient the camera a little bit so it can see the vise head. All I do, take my little hatchet, position it where I need it, tap, tap, tap. Tough stuff, this Jarrah. And then about the same length. There you go. So now I have my three wedges to put into my hammerheads. Now obviously I only have two hammerheads to haft today, but that'll do. Alright, so hammerhead back on. Get my rubber mallet. Nice and firmly seated. I want to give it some solid blows, make sure it's nice up there. And then wrap it in a cloth just to protect the wood. Now I glue my wedges in. It's a pretty standard practice, but you may not if you want to be able to remove the wedge quickly for whatever reason. But I just get some good old wood glue, and the nozzle on this got gummed up a long time ago, so I just grab a stick. This will do. How to mistreat your tools 101. Anyway, Doesn't need a lot of glue. There's not going to be a lot of space between this and the wood. The saw kerf, funnily enough, actually helps this because there's those kind of horizontal lines from the saw kerf. It actually helps this adhere to the walls of the wedge slot. A minute. And all I do, seat it in there. You can use a rubber mallet, wooden mallet, steel mallet, doesn't really matter, it's not going to hurt it. And I normally either put it on my anvil or the anvil of a vise. If you've got a vise that's got one of those square anvils like mine does, and then just drive it the rest of the way home. And if I feel like it needs a little bit more persuasion, go for a steel hammer. Yeah, that's not going any further. And then I'll just chuck it up in the vise, grab my back saw, and trim. There you go. Now there's a million things you can do to finish these up. You can grind them, you can do all that kind of stuff. I don't particularly like grinding them because I tend to risk grinding my forged surface. What I'll normally do is grab my carving knife, which you will know from my my bio pic, the pic on my YouTube page, and I'll just kind of carve the edges around just to give it a bit of a handmade aesthetic. Helps if it's sharp, which is this thing is, and don't slip and cut yourself. And yeah, it just gives it a little bit more of a flourish, makes it look more handmade, even if this is a prefab handle. It just makes it a little more personalized, but you're free to do whatever you like. And now I'll just grab a bit of 400 grit sandpaper, and I like to just 400 over any prefab handle because they tend to be fairly rough from the machining. I also douse this down with methylated spirits just to bring up the grain a little bit. Makes it a little easier to smooth. And then I'll grab some linseed oil. Good old standard boiled linseed oil. It's the best thing for tool handles I've found, because it's easy, it's cheap, it's easy to replace, and it protects the wood quite well. And I'll just give that a going over. You'd be surprised the quality, some of the wood that you can get out of the Bunnings bin. This has got some nice curl in it actually, and a little bit of interesting grain patterning. So yeah, I'll just oil down the handle, oil down the head. This linseed oil is actually really good to protect your forged finishes as well. And what I'll normally do is, because the end grain is always really thirsty, I'll give it a bit of a sploosh of linseed oil, let it soak in there nice and well. Basically I'll lather this in linseed oil and leave it aside for a couple hours, and then I'll wipe it down, and I'll give it another couple coats over the next couple of days before I send it off. But there is one finished rounding hammer, and now I've just got 2 more to do. Well, actually 1 more today. Thanks for tuning in, guys. So that's Sunday done for me. These two hammers came out really nice. I'm actually pretty proud of how they came out. There's a thumbnail. But yeah, so these two are customer hammers. The third one, for those of you who are coming to the Perth Knife Makers meet, I'm going to be putting an update about this tonight on the group. I am going to be raffling that off as a raffle prize. So if you're interested in getting into the raffle, if you're coming to the Perth Knife Makers meet, make sure to bring cash. We will also have card facilities on site. So yeah, that one will be going in a raffle. These two are going to customers. I hope they like them. But yeah, this is Sunday day. It's not too bad for 2 days work, but yeah. Next thing we'll be working on the guard and that kind of stuff for the Basilard. The workday never ends.